Rob here from No BS Photo Success. I'll give you a quick review on a book that I just read by Chris Knight. I had an interview with Chris 2 months ago, a webinar, and I have to tell you, it was interesting because Chris is an old soul. Here's a picture of him right here. Check it out. I expected him to be, he looks older. I thought he was mid-40s. He's only 32, but he's a very insightful, full of ideas kind of individual. Now, what had happened during that particular webinar was we had a technical glitch. So I couldn't see how many other people were in the room. I couldn't see how many questions were coming through. And I couldn't share the screen. We couldn't show his screen. So we ended up just talking, which was okay because Chris is the kind of guy that is filled with ideas. Published a book. I went on Amazon, and here it is. It's called The Dramatic Portrait, and I bought myself a copy. I don't care if you're just starting out or if you're an old-timer like me. This is a good book. You got to get your hands on this. It's filled with information. I'm going to give you a quick review, sort of an overview of what it is that this book's all about. There's no scenery, there's no wedding photography, none of that stuff. This is strictly to do with creating very high quality, distinctively looking portraits. Now, what was cool about this book, and I really thought this was really neat, you may not, especially if you're younger and you're anxious to get to the good stuff, you may think, well, why is there a whole section on history? Trust me on this one. You want to take in that first part of the book. He's got about 50 pages dedicated to everything from way back in time, ancient Egypt, the Greeks, the medieval times, the Renaissance period, all the way up to the birth of photography. It's really interesting. And the way Chris sort of lays it out, the amount of information he gives you is just the right amount. He doesn't go too in-depth, but he doesn't hold back too much. He gives you almost just the right amount that you need to know in order to have an appreciation of how portraiture evolved over the history of mankind. He's funny too. He makes a lot of jokes in there, and it just gives it that extra punch. So I found myself chuckling quite a bit. So the other part of the book too is dedicated to lighting. Now this is very well done, very detailed, very specific. That's one area where I would be tempted to say he's almost got too much information. But when it comes to lighting, I've always said lighting is infinitely complex, but ridiculously simple. So taking all that in, it's important to understand all the different layers of lighting so that you can get a true appreciation. I highly encourage you to get this book and read it. So I want to really reach out to Chris and thank Chris for putting this together. And hopefully we're going to get him back onto another webinar soon enough with no technical glitches. And he seemed to be open to the idea to do more. So we'll talk about that later. A couple other thoughts. These are just really irrelevant, not really a big deal. They may sound like they're critiques, but they're not. I don't like nitpicking. I'm not that kind of guy. But there was a section in here on lighting. It's on page 87. How fall off controls contrast. So in other words, you bring the light in, there's more contrast. You bring the light back, there's less contrast. Well, that's sort of inaccurate in a sense because you have edge transfer. As the light comes in, the light actually gets softer, so the contrast between the true tone and the shadows and speculars get larger and in effect softer. So not a big deal, okay? That's not the end of the world, so I don't want to really dwell on that. The other thing that I I thought, well, why? Yeah, and I say this for those who are especially starting out and trying to handle lighting. He talks about color space. He uses a color space that is like, you know, the space shuttle, when all you need is a small glider. Because color space really ultimately matters in final output. So if you're using a big, giant Formula 500, 600 horsepower car, but all you need to do is go down the block to Walmart, you don't need all that horsepower. I mean, it's a little nitpicky thing. It's just something in my photography business, in my studio, I resolved decades ago when I got into digital, where we shot and everything gets printed at sRGB. So that's just something I only say for the benefit of those who are a little bit confused. You don't need a whole lot of equipment, and you don't need to shoot 100% all the time in a large color space. You can if you want. I'm not criticizing that particular work style, okay? So I just want to make sure you all understand that. There's a bit of product placement too. So there's some very expensive lights that Chris talks about in here. He mentions in the back of the book that really that's not that important. The equipment is not the end all be all, but it sort of is. So, but my thing has always been light is light is light. I use Alien Bees in my studio and have and always probably will. The lights that he's using are very pricey. So I'm saying that for the benefit of the photographer who's just starting out. If you think you need to shoot with these high-end lights, if you think you need to shoot with a huge color space, and if you need to have a very complicated workflow, it's not really necessary. So, but I'm going to tell you, this has got a lot of really solid information. This is one of probably the best books I have personally gotten my hands on in my career so far as a photographer, and I highly encourage anybody to pick it up, get yourself a copy, and go through it. You'll thoroughly enjoy it. Thanks.